Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of How Stories Work. Today, I want to talk about stories of virtue and how that hooks up with the dramatic argument of a story. If you come into subtext and you go into the premise builder here, you'll find there are four different kinds of endings in a story. You can either have a triumph, you can have something that's a little more virtuous, which is what we'll be talking about today. You can have bleak stories, and then you can have your tragedies. The way that these are defined is a combination of the story outcome and the story judgment. Those two dynamics work together to help define the meaningful ending of your story. So if you have a successful outcome and everybody feels great about it, and it was a good thing that happened, then you have a triumph. If it is a failure and everybody feels miserable and it was a bad thing, then you have your tragedies. And then the two in the middle are a mix. Typically, we think of these as bittersweet stories, with the first one having an emphasis on the sweet. So these are ones where there's a failure in the objective story plot, but it was a good thing that it was a failure. So that's why you have the bittersweet. And then you have the other side, which is more of the bitter end of things, where even though everything was a success, it turned out to be a bad thing that it was a success. And that's why you have more of the bitter end of bittersweet. So today I want to talk about virtuous stories, because what happens when writers try to define what is the central argument of their story, they get tripped up. And the reason for that is quite simple to see. If you look at a triumph story, and let's just take your typical story where the main character is arguing avoidance, running away from problems, and the influence character is arguing to go after things, so pursuit. So it's a typical argument of pursuit versus avoid. In a triumph, what'll happen is that main character will drop the avoid element in favor of pursuit. The story is arguing when you drop or abandon avoid and you replace it with pursuit, you're going to have success and it's going to be a good thing. And you'll see that signified here in the motivations box here of the dramatic argument. The main character's element is actually going to end up being their problem element as well in their personal main character through line. So that makes things really easy. Their personal problem, which is something separate from what's going on in the plot, is going to be a problem of avoidance, as well as being the central problem of the objective story plot. All you have to do is get rid of that avoidance, replace it with pursuit, and everything will work out great. In a virtuous story, when it turns out to be a failure, what happens is this main character crucial element, which is the central element that's motivating the story, it's where the meaning of the story is, moves out of the problem and moves into the solution, which is really confusing because what's going to happen now is in the plot, the main character is going to be arguing for avoidance, but then their problem is actually going to be pursuit in their personal through line. And that dissonance between being motivated by one element of a pair in the plot and then the opposite element of a pair in the personal through line is what leads to that failure good ending. That differential between the two has to work out in such a way that the main character will drop their argument for avoid in the larger picture and instead take it within themselves to be able to resolve their own personal issues. And that's why it becomes a story that's arguing something that's virtuous. Yes, you're going to fail, but it will be a good thing for you. And you get to that failure, you get to that good, virtuous feeling by moving into the solution. Practically speaking, I have a couple examples that I just put up. The first one is First Blood, which is not the greatest movie of all time, but it works out great because it does tell a complete story and it's simple enough that it's a great one for an example. The premise for First Blood is virtuous are those who make people conscious of something by counterattacking someone. So the idea is nobody is taking care of Vietnam veterans, and though you will fail, you're not going to be able to escape and live the life that you want to lead. At least you made people conscious of what was going on. And you did that by reacting or counterattacking somebody who's coming after you. The central argument in that story is going to be an argument between reaction versus proaction. In the plot, Rambo is arguing reaction. So he's not going to draw first blood. He drew first blood. That's reaction. Whereas Sheriff Teasel, a Brian Denny character, is proaction. He's trying to stop problems before they get worse. So his motivating side of things is proaction. Rambo's is reaction. They fight, they fight, they fight. And then eventually what happens is Rambo actually moves out of his proactive problem to do reaction. So here you can see it spelled out. Here's the objective story plot and the main character through line. You'll see Rambo is here in reaction and the sheriff is here in proaction. So that's the two opposing views that are creating conflict in the central plot. In order for it to work out in a virtuous story where it's failure good, or what can be called also a personal triumph, is Rambo's personal problem then has to be proaction and his solution is reaction. And so what happens practically is he removes this counterattacking thing, essentially just stops it so that he can then have that big speech at the end where he overreacts and he gets all emotional and he releases all that inner angst, which proves to be a good thing for him. He gets the kind of reaction that he wanted in a global scale in himself personally. And so while it wasn't a huge success, it was a failure, personally, it was a good thing. And that's one example. And if you want to, you can go into the Narrative First Analysis archives, and I have it right here, First Blood, and I go through it here and then explain the same thing that I just went over if you want to do that by yourself. The second story that I've just done is Fight Club. So Fight Club argues virtue lies in being perceptive of things going on around oneself, even if it means being misunderstood by society. And the central argument here is an argument between aware and self-aware. So Tyler Durden, the Brad Pitt character, is arguing self-aware, and the Edward Norton character, the narrator, is arguing aware. And if you come into the analysis for this, I even give examples of quotes from the movie that explain their points of view. Tyler Durden argues that all the potential of this generation is being squandered, and that our great depression is the fact that we've all been raised to believe that we're going to be millionaires, movie gods, and rock stars, but we don't even know ourselves. So he's coming from a point of view of self-awareness. And then Edward Norton's narrator character is arguing awareness, where he defines himself by external indicators, the kind of IKEA furniture he has, the kind of car he drives, all that kind of stuff. So he's coming from a place of aware, and then Durden is coming from a place of self-aware. In order for the plot to fail, in order to prove that argument that it is more virtuous to be aware of the things that are going on around you, the same sort of dynamic has to happen that was in First Blood, where the problem in the objective story plot, self-aware, is carried by the influence character, and then the main character takes on aware. So Norton takes on aware here in the plot, and then Durden takes the self-aware element. And personal through line, the narrator himself has an actual problem of self-aware and a solution of aware. So his problem is the fact that he has no self-awareness. If you've seen the film, he has no idea who he is, no idea why he's staying up late at night. And essentially that's what's driving all of his angst, is this complete lack of self-awareness. Well, at the end, when he shoots himself, he's becoming aware. And what he's doing is he's removing the possibility of that awareness resolving issues in the objective story plot, figuring out how you fit in, and then allowing all the machinations of the Durden character, this self-aware, we need to make everybody come back into themselves, that is allowed to persist, which is why it ends up in a failure. So again, Norton will be arguing aware in the objective story plot when internally he's not driven by an awareness. Internally, his issue is the fact that he's not self-aware. The story premise is not something that just happens at the end. It actually defines the structure of the entire story. So it's essential that these two elements are balanced from the very beginning, because that's what creates the meaning of the story. And then lastly, I haven't written it up, but I always try and keep current examples. I can't stand when people who are talking about story structure always use the same examples from the 1980s. So this just came out a couple weeks ago, Don't Look Up, and it too is another failure good story. It argues virtue lies in proving something exists, even if it means being unable to do something about it. Here we have the Leo DiCaprio character, Richard Mindy, is coming from a point of proven. If I just keep proving it and proving it to them and giving them the information, eventually they'll come around. Whereas the Jennifer Lawrence character, Kate DiBiase, is completely dubious of anybody else and is coming from a place of presumption that no, like everybody's an idiot. They're never going to do anything about it. And she just impulsively doubts everyone's agenda. And that's the central argument that's going on in the story. Should we keep going with proven or should we keep going with presumption? At the end, what happens? Here we have the same line. Here's the Leonardo DiCaprio character. Here is his main character personal through line, which is this science genius that nobody's ever heard of, who all of a sudden is going out with Kate Blanchett. And there's this presumption that he's just going to fail. That's why he's having all that anxiety and he's never had a chance to actually show what he can do. That's where he's coming from personally. But then in the objective story plot, like I showed before, Lawrence is coming from presumption and he's coming from proven. And if there was some way that he could have eventually proven that these lame machines that you're trying to use to bore into the asteroids are not going to work, then maybe there would have been a way for society to be a little more intelligent about what it is that they're doing and actually be good citizens of Earth and actually save the Earth. But what happens is he removes that when he has his big blow up, he removes that out of the conversation of the objective story and just takes it into himself. And he realizes that he's proved himself to be an idiot. And when he's looking around at the dinner table, he's like, you know what? We had everything that we always needed right here. That's why the objective story fails, the plot fails, and instead everybody just slips into the consequence of the story, which would be doing, which is essentially doing nothing and just absorbing the impact of the comic. So that's it for this episode of How Stories Work. If you have any questions about writing a virtuous story, please let me know. Otherwise, I will see you next time.